Hello folks, Bob McKenzie here again at Bob's Fulton Woodworking. This video I'm going to go through the build for this king size bed. The bed is for a mattress that measures 80 inches in length, 76 inches in width, and is 11 inches thick. There is no box spring. I designed it so that the top of the mattress will be 27 inches off the ground. The headboard is black walnut, and the rest of the bed, the rails and the foot, are local hardwood silver maple. The slat supports are made out of 8/4 poplar, and the slats themselves out of simple pine. The first task was securing 6 or 7 good 8-foot pieces, 7 to 8 inches wide, with which I could start the build. As you can see, this turned into more of a cleanup and straightening process at my wood storage location. I got everything back to the shop, laid it out, let it sit for a couple weeks. As you can tell, some of the wood has significant checking on the ends, making these less than desirable length. To get around this, I designed a leg that essentially put a 4-inch extender on each end, giving me another 8 inches in overall length. Of course, the first step is to run all these pieces through the planer. The next step is to get 2 straight parallel edges on all these members. Here I'm using a homemade jig, which is essentially 2 3/4 inch pieces of plywood 4 inches wide, offset by 2 inches. You can see my original homemade hold downs, which I later replaced with some factory Rockler clamps. The way I use this is to adhere a 3/4 inch thick piece of plywood with double back tape up close to the blade to give the workpiece support. I then adjust the fence so that I'm shaving off just enough of the workpiece, and it ultimately then becomes parallel to the edge of the plywood. I then simply flip the board over and use the good edge against the fence, running it through the saw, giving me a parallel edge. You can see how dramatically these pieces were checked. I wanted to cut these off before I ran them through the saw to get them to final width. Because these pieces are long and unwieldy, and I wanted to make sure I got a good 90-degree cut, I actually clamped these to my miter fence. Once I had the members to length, it was simply a matter of ripping them to proper width, which in this case is 7 inches. With the leg sections all cut to length and sorted out as to which rails they belong to, it was time to cut all the dados and the mortises on the members. The legs are attached to the rail and the footboard with a floating tenon and pocket screws. Also, the knockdown hardware has to be recessed into a dado. In order to do this with the router, I built a new jig. There are many videos online making jigs similar to this, so feel free to fast forward through this if you'd like. But I started out with a 1/4 inch piece of hardboard to make the router base. I took the base over to the router table and cut 2 1/4 inch slots so that I could adjust the guides. I made 2 sets of guides, one deep and one narrow. The deep one I fixed with hanger bolts, and the shallower guides I glued in some carriage bolts with CA glue. Here you can see how this all sort of fits together. Once it's all assembled, I put a quick coat of wax on it for ease of movement. It's not critical about the alignment of the slots on the side and the router on the base, because once you find the center of the board with the router bit and clamp the guides in, you're good to go. Since I had several of these to make, I set up this workstation. Here I am cutting the slots for the loose tenons. And here, cutting the recess for the knockdown hardware. I'm using a 5/8 inch plunge router bit, plunge just a little over 1/8 of an inch. The knockdown hardware also requires an additional recess so the hook will not impinge on the leg. Here I am cutting that additional recess. I'm using a 1/4 inch plunge router bit. I'm doing this by sight using the same jig. After all the router work, it was now time to taper the legs. Here's a mock-up of what I came up with. The blue gets removed, the yellow is the thickness of the rails. To get this taper, I use a tapering jig. First, I extend the cut line on the saw blade. Then it's a matter of lining up the start of the cut at the saw blade and the end of the cut with the mark I put on the top of the saw. Then it's just a matter of cutting off the tapers. Here's a detail of the final mortising for the knockdown equipment. Notice that there's only a 1/16 of an inch of material left on the edge. As a result of that, I installed the hardware as soon as I got to this stage to prevent breakage. To make the floating tendons, which are 5 inches wide, I resawed a piece of maple. Took it over to the planer until I got a nice snug fit. Then it was a matter of cutting off the number of pieces I needed. I will save this stock as it fits the 1/4 inch router bit for future use. Before we can do the assembly, we have to cut the mortises in the long members. I'm using the same jig. This is a slow process, 1 inch deep, 1/4 inch at a time. Assembly is pretty straightforward, but a little bit awkward because of the long, lengthy pieces. I first used the pipe clamps to bring everything together and get things lined up. Then at each joint where there was a pocket hole screw, I applied a clamp to make sure I had a flush mating. Then I applied cauls at each of the joints while the glue dried. The headboard is somewhat randomly widthed planks of black walnut, 19.5 inches long, mounted vertically. Once I got the pieces positioned as I liked them, I went about putting them together using biscuit. I did this in sections, the first 3, and then I put those 3 together. This helped me better control the flatness of the final slab. Breaking this up into sections proved out to be the right way to go. I only had to deal with 2 joints in the final glue up. After the glue dried, I did some minor cleanup with the scraper and the sander. This isn't final cleanup. I'm only trying to get it to the point where I can run it across the table saw without any impediments. The final sizing of this headboard insert was iterative. I cut the majority off on the first pass and then took about 1/2 of blade kerf on the final cut. In the glue up process, I made sure that one edge was sufficiently flat to ride on the saw fence to give me a starting point. The glue up of the headboard was done in 2 phases. I glued the slab top and bottom first. I may regret this down the road, but I used biscuits and glued the top and the bottom together. Differential expansion may prove this to be a problem. The second portion of the headboard glue up was to put the 2 side members on. These are put on with floating tenons. The headboard insert was a full inch shorter than the inside dimensions of the headboard, giving me a 1/2 inch on each side. This helped in the fit up as well as potential differential expansion issues. I sanded everything to 220 grit, and before final sanding I rounded over all the edges with a 3/16 inch round over bit. The mattress requirements are that the slats be spaced no further than 5 inches apart. I used a 8/4 piece of poplar to start making the slat supports. There are 3 slat supports, 2 that run down the outside rails and 1 that runs down the middle. The outside slat supports are dadoed to receive the 1x4 slats that run crosswise. I pre-drilled the slat supports and glued and screwed those to the rail. Note that I'm bridging over that critical joint between the leg and the rail for additional strength. As I mentioned earlier, the slats are simply a 1x4 piece of pine cut to length where I rounded off the edges. Before applying any finish, I sanded and buffed all the pieces all the way up to 4000 grit. For the finish, I used BioShield Hard Oil number 9 on the walnut. All the oil finishes that I tried on the silver maple gave too deep of an amber hue, so I went with 3 coats of paste wax. There you go, folks. That's the build for the king size bed. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget, you can follow me on Instagram, and on the way out, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below. Until next time, happy woodworking.